I would like to start off by welcoming you on behalf of the One Health Education Committee. My name is Josh Houry, and I am the Community Relations Coordinator here at the Sask SPCA. And once again, thanks for being here today. The One Health Education Committee was established to help improve the quality of life for animals and humans by providing education for animal welfare and human service professionals. This webinar was part of a six-part series that explored the complex relationship between animal abuse and violence towards people. Today's presentation will provide an overview of the link between animal abuse and interpersonal violence. And we know that there will be questions, so we are certainly more than happy to take your questions, and we invite you to share any questions that you may have by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Once again, hover your mouse down there and you will see Q&A. You can click that and type your question, and we will answer questions as we go through the webinar. If you do have a microphone and you are interested in asking your question verbally, we can accommodate that as well. All you will need to do is click the raise hand button. That will be a notification to us that you would like to communicate using your microphone, and we can give you access to speak directly with Don. I would now like to move on to welcome today's speaker, Don Ferguson. How are you today, Don?
Doing well, thank you for having me, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Don Ferguson is the Executive Director of Animal Protection Services of Saskatchewan, the animal protection agency responsible for enforcing the Animal Protection Act in Saskatchewan, except for within the City of Regina. Prior to joining APSS, Don investigated over 4,000 files of animal cruelty and neglect with the Alberta SPCA and the Calgary Humane Society as a peace officer under the Animal Protection Act of Alberta. He has also instructed at the Justice and Solicitor General Staff College, providing instruction for the Alberta Peace Officer Investigator program. Don is a registered veterinary technologist with the Saskatchewan Veterinary Medical Association and completed his diploma in 2005 from Lakeland College in Vermilion, Alberta. Prior to his law enforcement career, Don served 20 years in the Canadian Armed Forces with the Canadian Airborne Regiment and the 1st Battalion of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Thank you for being here today, Don. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I appreciate it. Now, hopefully, I can still navigate all of the windows that we had before. So hopefully now everybody's able to see my screen, and I will just assume that everybody can. Thanks again for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity. I realized this was scheduled for earlier before the other presenters. Unfortunately, COVID took its toll on me and I was unable to present that day, so I appreciate everybody attending today. So hopefully everyone's had the opportunity to listen to the other speakers. I was able to go back and look at a number of them. Some of the information that I'm going to cover today will be repetitive. However, it comes from a law enforcement perspective that I'm presenting today, and hopefully you'll be able to see the value in it. The key areas that I'm going to cover today is animal abuse, a definition that we're going to use for our discussion today. I'll provide some statistics as well. These statistics are based on research that has been done, which actually supports the anecdotal evidence that I've seen throughout my career. It's very interesting, and you'll see a number of references to a study that was done by Van Wilk, Hardeman, and Endenberg in 2018, so a fairly recent study of 90 cases of animal abuse with 97 offenders. And it really solidified information that I'd seen in my career, but this was actual research that now supported what I'd been observing. I'm then going to go into interpersonal violence and the link connection and how that is. So for today's purpose, rather than using the definition that we use in the Animal Protection Act for what is abuse or distress, distress includes abuse in Saskatchewan. For today's presentation, we're going to use abuse, and it's defined this way: a non-accidental, socially unacceptable behavior that causes pain, suffering, or distress to and/or the death of an animal. And you can see the reference where that was taken from at the bottom. So animal abuse, unfortunately, unless it's an agency like Animal Protection Services, the Calgary Humane Society, I know Edmonton Animal Care and Control has their specific investigative unit to deal with these cases. Unfortunately, animal abuse is still not yet a priority for police or even health services. We know that many of the cases are underreported and certainly underinvestigated, and this applies both in rural and urban areas. Before, there was a belief that this was just in rural areas, but in fact, we see now that it's across the spectrum that this is underreported. So there's our definition of animal abuse, and that's all well and good. But what is animal abuse? What does that fit into? So animal abuse is attentional cruelty or abuse. It is neglect. It is animal fighting and animal hoarding. And so what I mean by intentional cruelty or abuse is the person knowingly deprives an animal of food, water, shelter, socialization, veterinary care, or maims, manipulates, or kills an animal. And in most cases, the research shows that these people actually take satisfaction in the harm of the animal. In terms of animal abuse being neglectful, a person fails to provide the necessities of life: food, water, shelter, grooming, and veterinary care. And these are acts of omission, and they don't necessarily bring satisfaction to the owner. There's not that criminal element where this was willfully done. Animal fighting, where we're specifically breeding animals that are put together to fight to provide entertainment for people, in Canada is criminal in nature, as well as against most, if not all, of the provincial statutes. And then finally, animal hoarding, where a person accumulates a large number of animals and doesn't provide them with the appropriate shelter, water, food, or veterinary care. So what constitutes intentional abuse? That would be shooting, beating, torturing, mutilation of any kind, throwing, burning, animal fighting, as we discussed again. So these are intentional acts of abuse and not abuse by omission. Drowning, kicking, suffocating, poisoning, stabbing, hanging, dragging, and includes animal sexual assault. So as I spoke about at the beginning, I'd seen a number of these things throughout my career in different investigations, and I'd sort of drawn a profile of what these individuals that we would typically deal with in these situations looked like. And then the research came out by Van Wilk, Hardeman, Enberg in 2018. And what I found was this really solidified what my belief, or what I was observing, of who abused animals. So who abuses animals? Well, 89% of the individuals are male and 11% are female. The average age was 34 to 36 years old, respectively. 34% are single, 40% are unemployed, and 25% of the individuals have one or more diagnosable psychological disorders, and they're in debt. In terms of the in debt, one of the things that research showed was not that they were low on the financial scale, but just that they had a significant, generally, most of them had a significant amount of debt. So it was quite an interesting thing to see. It's exactly what I'd sort of expected to see when the research came out. So why do people abuse animals? Well, there's a number of reasons, and a number of them are there. Frustration, excitement, the desire to hurt, to take revenge, control or manipulate. Well, the research showed that 50% of the reason was aggression, and 70% of those that were in the study had committed other violent crimes. I know Dr. Doyle, and I'll mention them at the end of the presentation, some of the statistics that were there. There used to be, that's now been debunked, the trifecta of serial killers, where they would begin to light fires, then abuse animals, and then begin abusing children and the elderly before they became serial killers. When in fact, we now see that the research, by the time someone has actually been caught intentionally abusing animals and convicted, they're already halfway through their violent criminal career. They just haven't been caught yet in most cases. So people have different motives for abusing animals. Power and control will mainly play a part when animal abuse takes place in the context of interpersonal violence. Most of the people who abuse animals have had a negative childhood experience, either having been a victim of and or seen interpersonal violence and or animal abuse. And these people that have been exposed to that are 3 times more likely to abuse animals than people who've not had similar experiences. Interpersonal violence, as the presenters before me have indicated, consists of a complex range of controlling behaviors that may include any combination of physical, emotional, sexual, economic maltreatment, as well as isolation, intimidation, and threats. But the one that we're looking at is, for the most part, in terms of the interpersonal violence, is that people will use animals, or the abuser will use animals as a way of exerting their power and their control. So to control, the other reason that they do, or some of the other reasons they do this, is to be able to control an animal. This includes not knowing how to deal with an animal's behavior, so kicking, hitting, etc., to teach the animal a lesson. It's abusive in nature. To get back at an animal, so the animal is peed on the bed or the carpet, and I'm going to beat you senseless. Sadly, that's actually a statement that was provided to me in a suspect interview. To get back at another person, so once again, a spouse is upset with their partner for some reason, so they hurt the pet to teach them a lesson, therefore exerting the control that I spoke about. Interestingly enough, they also found abusing animals was to satisfy a prejudice against a particular species or breed. And we saw this in areas of prejudices against pit bulls, where people would be more violent against them because they naturally assumed from some of the negative ways that pit bulls have been portrayed that these are bad animals and they deserve to be maltreated. To make an animal a scapegoat, I've had a really bad day, so they're going to take it out on the animal. And then, of course, there's the non-specific sadism, where some people just receive pleasure from hurting others, or others in this context being animals. So those are some of the reasons why they abuse the animals. So when do we see abuse? We see abuse, 52% occurs spontaneously. A lot of the time, obviously, where drugs and alcohol are involved. 26% of the time it's premeditated. And these are in domestic or interpersonal violence situations. And where do we see abuse? Well, 45% takes place generally behind closed doors in the abuser's home. So unless it's reported by an individual in the home, agencies like Animal Protection Services or the Saskatchewan Police Service or the Prince Albert Police Service, RCMP, aren't always aware that this abuse is going on. So understanding the link between interpersonal violence and violence against animals and how it coexists is important for all law enforcement or other agencies that are dealing with families in domestic situations. And then again, 39% occurred in the public domain. Dr. Doyle, from her presentation, emphasized this quite well, and the research bears it out. So when do we see abuse and where do we see abuse is there, but who does the abuse happen to? in particularly the context with regard to animals. And so the abuse happens, 79% are companion animals, and there's 3 times as many dogs than cats are abused. And as Dr. Doyle had indicated in her presentation, the most at-risk group was those under 2 years of age. And 47% involved the offender's own animal. And in this particular group of offenders, 43% of the animals died as a result of the abuse, either directly or required euthanasia. So I talked earlier about where different types of abuse is, and I spoke about specifically hoarding as being a type of abuse. And so now just a brief, we've seen a snapshot of what the research shows a person who abuses animals looks like in the intentional and accidental omission context, but now what does it look like in the hoarding context? And you hear the stereotypical crazy cat lady. Interestingly enough, this isn't a stereotype. The research actually shows that hoarding is mostly female. They're in their mid-50s, single, socially isolated, mainly cats and dogs. And there's usually 30 to 40 animals, sometimes more. It has been my experience frequently more. And they ascribe human qualities to animals. And that's from Dr. Bradios's paper in 2019. So animal abuse. Well, why should we care about it? Well, the reason we should care is the abuse hurts the animal. The abuse is likely to escalate. The abuse is likely to be co-occurring at the same time with humans involved in that. And it is an indicator of family dysfunction. So ignoring the cruelty or neglect of an animal by a pet owner not only allows that maltreatment of that animal and additional animals that the person may acquire to continue to go unchecked, it also puts at risk the humans and making similar demands on those people in the home. So you can see that there can be an escalation over why they're abusing the animal to then escalate to the humans in the home. And it's important for human and animal welfare professionals to take animal abuse seriously and to recognize that it is a possible indicator of serious family dysfunction, including violence against human members in the family. There's an amount of research that's been done primarily in the United States by, at Northeastern University. In 1997, they examined the criminal records of 153 animal abusers and 153 non-abusers over a 20-year period. And they found that people who abuse animals are far more likely than non-abusers to commit violent crimes. So that was a 20-year period. So that was quite a large study that was done. And Kelter and Feldhaus studied the relationship between cruelty to animals and the aggression among criminals and non-criminals. And they found, again, significantly higher rates of cruelty towards animals amongst aggressive criminals. So interpersonal violence and animal abuse. So what's the link between animal abuse, excuse me, and violent offenders? Well, violent incarcerated offenders have reported a childhood history of animal abuse to the point where 60% of them had a history of animal abuse. Animal abuse in school shootings. 45% of the people who engaged in school shootings also engaged in animal abuse. Animal abuse and child sexual abuse. Children that have been sexually abused are more likely to abuse animals. What was interesting was the research indicates that 50% of children will witness some form of animal abuse in their lifetime. And then finally, animal abuse and intimate partner violence. Domestic violence as I'm trying to remember who the presenter was, indicated that domestic violence victims are often report that their animals are abused too, and there's some statistics that support that as well later here in my presentation. So in the interpersonal intimate partner violence context, again, much like why should we care about animal abuse, why should we care about that interpartner violence? Well, 79% of the victims affected by interpersonal violence are women, and domestic homicides account for 1 in 5 or 20% of murders in Canada. So that means on average 69 women are killed by an intimate partner every year, and a woman is murdered by her current or former partner in this country every 5 days. And spousal violence, the investigation dealing with the perpetrator, supporting the one that's been offended against, the court system, all of those things. The cost in 2020 was $8.9 billion for that year, for what intimate partner violence costs. And besides the human cost, there's a significant financial cost to have this continue to occur. So physical abuse of humans or animals is not caused by mental or physical illness, genetics, alcohol or drugs, out of control behavior, stress, anger, the victim's behavior, or relationship problems. Many people and victims think that an aggressor hurts an animal because of the personal problems or mental illness. And if those problems are fixed, that the abuse will stop. They are wrong. While mental illness or substance abuse may make a situation more complicated, they are not the cause of the violence. And you saw in my previous slide why some of the people abuse animals and the reasons for this violence. So domestic violence, animal abuse, do the two really link? Well, a case example of Michael Cartier. Michael Cartier actually stalked and killed his partner, Kirsten Lardner, and this occurred in Boston, Massachusetts. He stalked and killed her, and then he killed himself. Prior to that breakup, Cartier held the Kristen's kitten under a hot shower and then shaved all its fur off. That was investigated. It was left without any significant intervention. And later he hurled the cat after police had become involved. Later, several days later, he actually hurled the cat through a 4th floor window to its death. And again, unfortunately, there wasn't significant intervention by law enforcement, and we ended up with the death of Kirsten Lardner as well as the perpetrator killing themselves. So the research shows a study done of 53 families with the Department of Children's Services for Child Abuse and Neglect. 60% had abuse towards their pets involved. 88% of the families who were physically abusive towards each other also were abusive towards the family pet. Another study done in 1998 on 38 battered women. They're still using that term. My apologies, I took it directly from the study. Occurred from a Utah shelter, and 74% of those women owned pets. 71 of those women indicated that their pets were also threatened, and 57% indicated that their pets had actually been harmed by the abuser. And what was scary, and which is nice, that the Saskatchewan SPCA is taking the steps to develop their emergency animal care center, is that 18% of the women in this study delayed seeking shelter because they didn't want to leave their animals behind and they were fearful for their pet's safety. Another study in 2000 by Flynn, again, this was 107 women in a South Carolina shelter. 40% of those owned pets. 46 of the women's pets had been threatened or harmed. And in this case, 20% of the women had delayed seeking shelter for fear of leaving their pets behind. And most, if not all, I believe it was 98% of the women cited that their pets as sources of emotional support. They did an in-depth interview with 10 of these additional women. And obviously, for all of us that are probably on this webinar, they identified that the pets were regarded as family members and as comforters and protectors. More recent studies that occurred in the last 12 months, 82% of the women own pets. 46 of these women report that their batters both threatened to harm and actually harmed or killed their pets. And there was an increase of up to 26% of the women reported the concern over their pets affected their decision to seek shelter. And I just want to include, to reiterate, Dr. Doyle was able to, with the Calgary Police Service and the Calgary Humane Society, with COVID, garner some more recent statistics as of just the last couple of years. In the Calgary Police Service, in an 18-month period, 93% of the offenders charged with intentional animal abuse had also been either investigated, charged, or convicted of some form of domestic violence. 85% of those offenders were also involved in an average of 3 to 4 other criminal code offenses. So that's where, as I'd said earlier, that the people that are found abusing animals intentionally, that are convicted or charged, are already in the middle of their violent one. Before, we used to think that this was a beginning to their criminal history, when in fact we already know they're well into their violent criminal history at this point. So animal abuse in children. There was a study done by Rigdon and Tapia. This is back in 1977, and it was the first clear description and systemic study of children who commit animal cruelty. And they found that children that abused animals had additional antisocial behaviors. The children were more prone to bullying, temper control problems, lying, and stealing. And as I said before, half of all children are likely to witness animal abuse. 2/3 of male children may witness animal abuse, and 20% of those male children may perpetuate animal abuse. Cruelty to animals is a serious manifestation of psychopathology, particularly when paired with other symptoms and a troubled family history. Children growing up in homes where there is domestic violence are at risk for obvious psychological disturbance. And one of those disturbances is cruelty to animals. And this is probably sums all of sort of the One Health approach to interpersonal violence, animal abuse, and the link. And that's one by Phil Arco. And simply, when animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. From a strictly law enforcement perspective, reporting abuse and participating in investigations is key. Making a difference, so know the legislation within your jurisdictions. Report your concerns, so know when and how to make a complaint. An investigation will determine if there's a problem or not. And one of the things, as I indicated before, most of the abuse occurs, or a large percentage, we saw almost 50% occurs in the abuser's home. So be willing to provide statements and testify if this is something that you see. Without it, these cases are extremely difficult to prosecute without those participating and that participation. And I went really fast. So Josh, I hope there's a bunch of questions.
That was really fast, and we do not have any questions yet. However, there is still time for you to submit your questions. So, if you wanted to take a moment, think about your questions, I will chat with Don a little bit just to buy some time. And we'll wait for a few minutes, Don. And if nothing comes up, then I guess we can wrap things up here. But in the meantime, I'm
Well, I
just
was going to
one.
say it was hard. Sorry, it was hard because there were so many presenters before me. I was like, oh, I'm going over all of their stuff.
And then you wound up being the last presenter, so everybody may have heard
Yeah.
a lot of what you've provided. But it was still very insightful. And John, I know that there are some changes coming to enforcement in Saskatoon, and so for those that are on the call that may be curious, I'm wondering, and they may have seen the newspaper article this morning, but are you able to tell us a little bit about how those changes will impact animal protection enforcement in Saskatoon as effective July 1st?
So Animal Protection Services will be taking over the enforcement or the investigative duties of the Animal Protection Act in Saskatoon as of the 1st of July. We will have the same response as we do currently in the province. So that is a Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 response. After hours and emergencies, the Saskatoon Police Service, as in the legislation, are animal protection officers. There is obviously a concern that's been expressed by the Saskatoon Police Service that they don't have the training or the ability to do those. I would say that certainly Animal Protection Services would be more than happy to assist with any of their training shortfalls in that area. And certainly there are criminal code offenses related to animal abuse that we see are linked into other violent crimes. So I think it would be beneficial for that training to occur. I would like to see something similar that's occurred in other jurisdictions. So in Ontario, it's actually mandatory for all law enforcement to be educated on the link. I know they do touch at it in the police college here in Saskatchewan, but it's not mandatory that those officers take the training. Hopefully with advocacy groups getting behind it, that the Ministry of Justice decides that this is something that needs to be done and make it mandatory for all law enforcement officers to take the violence link training.
I think that would be certainly very beneficial for any law enforcement officer to learn a bit more about that. Thanks for sharing that information, John. And we do have some questions now. The first one asks, what changes would you like to see in terms of early intervention strategies for preventing harm to animals and people?
Oh, early intervention strategies. I think the first one is, again, education by first responders, understanding what is actually going on in a particular situation, with identifying how the family dynamics are. It's interesting that for the number of law enforcement agencies that have police and crisis teams that will respond to crisis where there's perhaps some family violence, there isn't been or hasn't been a lot of training for those first responders with regards to what's happening to the animals, and then keying into how the animals are interacting with people within the home to identify potential perpetrators of abuse.
That I think would be some great next steps for things in that area in terms of early intervention strategies for sure. Another question here, Don, is if there is a couple that is investigated for animal abuse, the animal gets seized and then the couple breaks up, can the victim get possession of the animal back if the aggressor is no longer in the picture, or does it depend on each case?
That's a case by case basis. We have had instances where animals were seized. During the course of the investigation, it was clear that one of the individuals in the home was perpetrating the violence. We did what is referred to as a KGB interview with both of the people in the home. And once there was a clear split and there was no potential for the individual likely to be going back, the animal was then subsequently released to that individual. But it is not always typical, and sometimes it's hard to determine. So it is a case by case basis, but there is a possibility. And of course, with that one, then there's now a case law for that to occur in the future should it happen in similar circumstance.
Good information to have. Thanks, Don. Another question that we have: do animal abuse police work with childhood sex crimes police, domestic abuse police, or human trafficking police? It looks like a lot of the information is similar. Information gathered may not affect one group, but could affect other groups.
I would love to say yes. The reality is, with currently the way that things are structured in Saskatchewan, we work more closely with the RCMP and the RCMP violent crimes group in those situations. Unfortunately, we haven't had the same level of cooperation or co-sharing of information with the police forces, Saskatoon, Regina, Prince Albert, and that. But those are relationships that we're working on fostering so that we can work closely with them because there is an overlap, and we know that there's an overlap. So working together and sharing information is key.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And the next question here, Don, asks, how does APSS work with other organizations to support victims of domestic violence if/when you attend an investigation where domestic abuse is present?
So in those situations, although we're not, we have yet to be prescribed as peace officers in the regulations, all of the officers, all the animal protection officers with animal protection services are trained to that level. And the expectation is that if there is any suspicion of any wrongdoing, whether it's towards children, interpersonal violence, the appropriate authorities are contacted. Most times when we're still on scene, where it is available, we have the police and crisis teams attend with us as well, so that we can ensure that those situations are rectified right away. We've actually seen an increase. I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but since last year, since we did the beginning One Health series, we've actually seen a lot more information sharing with children's services and reporting and cross-reporting of incidents between our agencies. So I think that information is getting out there, so it's nice to be able to work with them. But yeah, all of our staff are required to report those concerns and provide it to the appropriate agency, including public health. So if we have a hoarding situation where obviously there's significant concerns with regard to the property, public health is also notified, as well as the appropriate agencies if there's children or violence in the home.
Very good information. Thanks again, Don. And our last question here is, what would you like to see in terms of future research? I'm assuming this is specifically on the topic of the link.
I would really like to see some more follow-up with what has actually occurred with the research that occurred in the Netherlands that I referenced, that what I had seen as anecdotal evidence it's difficult, unfortunately, to get people that have been convicted of violent crimes to talk to and provide truthful information as to what motivates them to perpetuate these crimes. Because I think getting a better understanding of why people do this might help us in terms of preventing it in the future.
That I think would be very helpful for sure. Well, thank you, Don. That is all of the questions that have been submitted. Before we say farewell today, though, there are a couple of things that I want to make folks aware of. You will see a link pop up, possibly in chat here. Or when you hit end meeting, there will be a link that a survey request that pops up. We ask that you take a few minutes to fill out that survey. That helps us determine, and there it is in the chat now, that helps us determine content for future webinars. So we would appreciate if you take a moment to fill that out. You can also share some feedback on today's webinar. If you need a certificate of participation for CE credits, we can certainly provide you with one. Just email info@saskspca.ca and we'll get that certificate out to you. And finally, please take a moment to sign up for our mailing list. And that mailing list is used to send out information on future webinars. That link will also be in the chat. And if you don't see it in the chat, you can find it at saskspca.ca/webinar sign up. Don, do you have any closing remarks?
Other than when dealing with animal abuse, if you see something, say something. We can't always be there to witness these things. So if you are seeing any type of violence towards animals or abuse, please report it.
I agree. If you see something, say something. Thanks again, Don, and thanks to everybody who joined us here today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your lunch hour with us.